This is what the word of the Lord says. Once again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. When it was full, the fishermen pulled it up on the shore. Then they sat down and collected the good fish in baskets, but threw away the bad fish. This is how it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous, and throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We live in a world, brothers and sisters, that is fascinated with the future. We live in a world, in a culture, in a society that wants to know what's going to happen tomorrow, that is worried about the future, that is anxious about tomorrow. We want to know if our economy is going to get better when the next prime minister is elected. We want to know if the weather is going to be better next month. We want to know whether we are going to live long enough to be able to see our grandchildren grow. We live in a culture that wants to know what's going to happen tomorrow. I remember when I was a kid, I used to love eating at Chinese restaurants. And it was not because of the food. But don't get me wrong, I love Chinese food. The reason why I wanted to go to Chinese restaurants with my parents was because at the end of the meal, they would give us fortune cookies. And so I wanted to go there because I wanted to see what the future had in store for me. And so my parents would not eat those cookies, so I would fight with my siblings for their cookies because we wanted to be told the future. We wanted to be told the future. My grandmother, before I tell you that story, even today I really know what's going to happen in the future. I'm fascinated by the future. Whenever I go to have breakfasts with Anna at A&W, there are magazines there, and sometimes you get to see the horoscope. And so I cannot help but whenever we're eating, just read the horoscope section, just because it's not that I believe in that stuff or because I think that the stars have the ability, whenever we read the stars, we gain the ability to know the future. It's because I'm curious. I'm curious about the future. I want to know what's going to happen tomorrow. My grandmother, as I was going to tell you, before she became a Christian, she used to go visit the palm reader near the house where we used to live in Colombia. And whenever she would go and see the palm reader, there would be a huge lineup waiting to speak to this man. And so, because sometimes she had to wait for hours, she would strike a conversation with the person in front of her. And so they would talk to one another, and my grandmother would tell that person, this is what I'm going through, this is what's happening in my life right now. I'm struggling with this disease, my marriage is going through this, I would like this to happen in the future, I want my life to be like this or like that. And, she would talk to that person. And then when it was time for her to see the palm reader would tell my grandmother everything that she was going through in her life, down to the smallest detail. And then he would tell the future. And my grandmother would be amazed, because not only did this man have the ability to know the future, but this man also had the knowledge of everything that she was struggling with in her life. After a few months, she became suspicious. And then she realized that the person with whom she would strike a conversation actually worked for the palm reader. So the palm reader was a fraud. He was a fraud. But Jesus, brothers and sisters, Jesus knows the future. Jesus was not a street magician who did miracles just to make money off people. He was not a false prophet. He was not a street performer who simply wanted to entertain the crowds. He is the Son of God. And as the Son of God, he really knows what's going to happen in the future. And in the passage that we've read this morning, Jesus is telling us plainly what's going to be happening on the last day. The angels of God are going to gather everyone up, and they are going to separate the wicked from the righteous. And the wicked are going to be thrown into the blazing furnace, the fiery furnace, where there is going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's the future. But people generally today, they don't care about what Jesus has to say. They don't care about the fact that he has revealed the future. Did you know that in the year 1971, the population of Canada identified themselves, 90% of the population, they identified themselves as Christian? Today, 2024, only about 50% of Canadians are Christians. And apparently in the next 25 years, the numbers of Christians in this country are going to go down, while false religion is going to rise and atheism is going to rise. I was reading a report by the ABC News where the reporter was saying that churches in North America are closing down at a faster rate than ever before. People don't want to go to church. People don't want to know about God. They don't want to hear about what Jesus has to say regarding the future. Churches are being turned into bars and nightclubs. They are being sold to millionaires who are turning churches into mansions, their homes. Why is it that nobody wants to, even though there is a fascination with the future, why is it that nobody cares about what Jesus has to say regarding the last days? Why is that? I think that the Apostle Paul gives us the answer in 2 Timothy chapter 3, where he says, Timothy, I want you to know that the last days are going to be terrible. When the last days arrive, things are going to be terrible. And among the things that he says to Timothy, he says that in the last days, people are going to become lovers of self. They're going to become lovers of money. They will love pleasure rather than love God. So if we take the words of the Apostle Paul seriously, one of the reasons why people don't want to hear about what Jesus has to say regarding the future is because they don't love God anymore. It's because they have exchanged the love that they ought to have towards God, and instead they have chosen to love themselves, they have chosen to love money, and they have chosen to love pleasure. And what the Apostle Paul says echoes what Jesus said in John chapter 3, where he says, this is the verdict. The light has come into the world, but the world has loved darkness more than the light because their deeds were evil. So the second person of the Trinity became a man. He came to save the world. The Word became flesh. The light came into the world, and yet the world chose to love darkness more than the light. Why? Because their deeds were evil. Because the light shines upon darkness. Because the light exposes darkness. And so people don't want that. And so instead of submitting their lives to the Lord, they choose to live in sin. They choose to keep on living immoral and sinful lifestyles. And they don't want Jesus because Jesus exposes their wicked ways. And so when Jesus speaks here in the parable that we've read this morning, he is giving a warning to everyone who hears these words. And at the same time, he's telling us that at the end of the age, this is what's going to happen. This is the future. The wicked are going to be separated from the righteous, and they will be thrown into a fiery furnace where there's going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And the instruments of God by which he carries out this separation are the angels themselves. So the parable starts like this. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into a lake. And when the net was full, the fishermen pulled it out of the water, and they sat down by the shore, and they began to separate the good from the bad fish. The bad fish were thrown away, while the good fish were put into baskets. And Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is like this. Now, when Jesus talks about a net here, he's not talking about a net that is thrown into the lake or the water by a single fisherman. Jesus is actually referring to a huge dragnet that was used to gather huge amounts of fish. One side of the net would be attached to one boat, while the other side of the net, the other end, would be attached to another boat. And then they would put floaters on the top of the net, and then weights at the bottom, so the net would become this massive net. And as the boats moved across the sea from one side of the lake to the other, it would gather up huge amounts of fish. And then the fishermen would pull that net out of the water, many fishermen, and they would sit down by the shore, and they would begin a long and painful process of sorting out the good from the bad fish. Now, generally speaking, the bad fish were the ones that you couldn't eat. They were not edible. So if the fish were too small, they couldn't be eaten. They had to be thrown back into the water. If the fish didn't have scales or fins, they could not be eaten. They needed to be thrown back into the lake. If the fish had whiskers near the mouth, like catfish, they couldn't be eaten. They had to be discarded. And so the fishermen would sit down, and they would take hours sorting the good from the bad fish. And Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is like that. The angels of God will call everyone, and they will separate the wicked from the righteous, and the wicked are going to be thrown into the fiery furnace where there's going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, out of all the descriptions of hell, Jesus could have said they're going to be thrown into a very sad place, or they're going to be thrown into a gloomy place. But Jesus, knowing what awaits in the future, he chose to describe this place as a fiery furnace. I'm not going to elaborate on that. I will give you next week. I will give you reasons why the doctrine of hell, the biblical doctrine of hell, does not contradict the goodness and the love of God. Now, we've spoken about these verses in the past. All I want to say is this: Jesus described hell as a place, as a blazing furnace. And he said that in this place there is weeping and there is gnashing of teeth. When he says that there is weeping, it means that people are conscious in hell. They're not asleep, they're not dead, they're weeping because they can feel and they can sense everything in this place. And when he says that there is gnashing of teeth, Jesus is trying to communicate that in hell, there is no repentance. In hell, people do not change for the better. In prisons today, when someone gets thrown into a cell, you know, our prison system here in Canada, they try to make people better. If you go to jail, you can actually get a job, you can get an education, you can learn how to sing, you can learn various skills, because the government wants to prepare the prisoner when the time that person gets out, you know, so that gets reincorporated into society as a good person. Hell is not like that. Hell does not make anyone better. It does not lead anyone to repentance. Hell is a place where there is gnashing of teeth, which means that people, even after finding themselves in this place, they continue to defy God. They continue to gnash their teeth at God. So what Jesus is teaching here is that hell is not restorative. It does not make anyone better. And so that's the end of the parable. Now, the obvious lesson that we learn from this is that at the end of the age, there is going to be a separation of the wicked and the righteous. That's the main lesson. But I've spoken about this in the past, so I'm not going to talk about this any further. What I think we can learn as well from this parable is that God one day is going to make things better. God one day is going to make everything better. That's what I want to focus on this morning. I was having breakfast the other day with my co-worker, and I don't know if this is true or not. I've only lived here for maybe 3 months, so I'll let you be the judge of that. I'm just going to tell you what he said. I'm neutral, okay? He said that he's not able to find a job here because, and these are his words, people from Southeast Asia have flooded this region, and they have become the owners of big companies, the Walmarts and the Canadian Tires. They're the managers there. They own hotels. They pretty much are in charge of like the big workplaces here in this region. And when it comes time to hiring people, what my coworker said is that they hire people of the same ethnicity as them, leaving out anyone who looks different from them. And so as I was listening to this, I was saying, you know, it could be true. Maybe it is true that the wicked and the ungodly are prospering in this place. And like the words of Jeremiah in chapter 12, I was saying, God, why is it that, you know, the ways of the wicked always prosper? Why is it that the faithless live at ease? Now, maybe I don't have the answer to that question. But what I can know for sure, is that one day God will make things right. When the angels of heaven separate the wicked from the righteous, and the wicked are thrown into the fiery furnace where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, God one day will make things right. 4 weeks ago, while I was preaching, my wife's phone rang, and it was in the middle of the sermon, so she turned her phone off. And when the service was over, she phoned her mom. It was her mom calling her, and she was worried. She thought that something bad had happened to her family, so she phoned her mom, and her mom told her that one of her best friends had died of cancer. She had a lump on her shoulder, and it was not hurting or anything. It wasn't anything serious. She just didn't like the way it looked when she wore a dress or something like that. She had a small lump there. So she went to the doctor, and the doctor didn't do the proper procedure when examining the lump. And so he went on to remove the lump by squeezing the lump. And so he drained the lump, and then apparently it was it was a cancerous lump. And so the cancer spread all over her body. And in a matter of 3 months, she passed away. When she was diagnosed with cancer, and while she was fighting this disease, she was only like 38 years old. She was angry at God because she would tell her pastor, I've been serving God all my life. I'm one of the leaders of the church. I do evangelism all the time. I talk to everyone about Jesus. I've been serving God, and I don't know why God has allowed me to be suffering with this terrible disease. I still have the whole world ahead of me. I'm very young. And so she passed away. We may not know why God allows Christians to suffer or to experience terrible deaths, like in the case of my wife's friend. But what we can know for sure, brothers and sisters, is that one day God will make things right. This is what this parable teaches. I don't know if you've been reading the news lately, but with everything that's going on in the Middle East, I've become very interested in getting myself in reading about what's going on with Syria and with the Muslim countries and all that. And so most of you know, I'm sure, that a couple of weeks ago, the Assad regime was overthrown in Syria. The president had to leave the country, he fled, and apparently he's living in Russia. Now, when the rebels took over the country, they found that the Assad regime had places, prisons, jails where people were being tortured to death. And I'm not going to describe the ways that they were punishing people, but when I read about the methods of torture that were being employed, I could not help myself but to wonder whether the people who were carrying out these massacres, if they were even human beings in the first place, because of the atrocities that they were committing. And as I read the news article, I kept asking myself, why, God, if you're a loving God, and if you're good, and if you're all powerful, why is it that you don't stop all these evils? Why is it that you don't do justice? Why did you allow these things to happen? And brothers and sisters, we may not get the answer to those questions in this life. Don't get me wrong. There's a biblical answer to these questions that I will give to you in the future. But sometimes we will not get the answer to these questions. We will not know why God allows evil in this world. We will not know why God allowed the Nazis to commit those atrocities. We will not know why God allowed such and such person to experience a rape or experience a physical abuse or something like that. But one thing we can know for sure. According to Jesus in Matthew chapter 13, the parable that we've read, God will make things right in the future. And so what Jesus is telling us here should give us hope and should give us the strength to continue trusting in God and waiting on God despite the circumstances in which we may find ourselves at this very moment in our lives. Some of us are going through financial crisis, and we work and we don't make enough, and we barely have enough to be able to survive. And we're not getting any younger, we're getting older, and we worry about the future, and we don't know what's going to happen with our lives. Others of us may be struggling with a terrible disease, or we know someone in our lives who is battling a terminal disease, and we don't understand why, and we don't have answers to the crisis and the storms in which we are finding ourselves living in spite of whatever we may be going through, brothers and sisters. One thing we can know for sure, that God will make things right in the future. God will make things right in the future.